All right. Welcome, everybody. I guess we need you, Craig, to read the minutes for us and the waiver for COVID.
Okay. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic and state of emergency, this meeting is being held by a live video teleconference pursuant to 2020 Senate Bill 150 and in accordance with KRS 61826 because it's not feasible to offer a primary physical location for the meeting. Thanks.
Thank you, Craig. Once again, some very thorough meeting minutes, I must say. Hopefully everyone has had a chance to review them. They were included in the packet that was emailed out late yesterday afternoon. Are there any comments related to the minutes? And if there's no comments, is there a motion to accept the minutes as proposed?
So moved.
Frank Penn's
Second. Yes.
Randall Vaughn seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The minutes are accepted as written. Thank you very much. We left our last meeting with cutting the conversation short related to costs that were not being considered by this study. And we probably ought to open the table up right now to further that conversation if one would like. And if not, we can move on with the Stantec team and Mark and talk more about the framework for evaluation matrix and the response. Mark, why don't we turn the table over to you?
Okay, I guess yeah, my microphone's off. All right, well, I think for right now, what we'd really like to accomplish is to get the buy-in, sign off on the framework itself. Craig sent out an email requesting everybody send in weights. We got about 6 responses, correct, Craig? Yeah, which he has averaged out, and so we've put those into our framework. And so we're going to look at how the scenarios compare with that framework. And we would really like to keep the conversation, or at least we would like to focus on how the framework reacts to the points for each of those questions, and how the framework itself will work and how the weighting affects those points. And we will provide as once we are complete with the full metric analysis, we can provide that when that's complete. But we're far enough down the road with it that we are very confident that the points based on the point scale that we're using are relatively set for each of these scenarios. There might be
Mark, let me ask Lynn if she will to put her phone on mute. There's a little bit of static coming through, Lynn.
I muted it for her, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We don't expect the points really to change based on our metrics. So we really want to focus more on how these various scenarios compare as an illustrative example of how the framework works. So that is our goal for today. Really, we'd like to get a sign off on the thresholds that we've talked about last week, and then also the framework itself, and ultimately what you guys think of the weights as we received. Right now, I'm going to show my screen. I've taken Craig's average and applied that to the matrix. So hopefully you can see my screen. I'm going to start with scenario 1 just to show you that we have completed the points for scenarios 1, 2, and 3. And each of these, so they all scored down. I've inserted the weights, the average weights for the 6 responses we've gotten back. I've left them in like a digital format. I've played around with it. I rounded to the 0.5 and I rounded to 0.0. We can always do that, but what I found is the percentages didn't change more than 1% at the very end. So for the time being, I've just left them as they were weighted from Craig. But what I've done is I've created a summary table here that lets us look at all of the scenarios in one place. and show you how the weights affect the final scores. So I'll start with, again, the general way we would approach this framework analysis, going back to these two-part questions. Does the first part, does the scenario as laid out create enough capacity to meet demand over 20 years for both a high and a low growth trend line? And if it does, it's definitely one of the questions is, can it meet the low trend line? But then the second trend line, it can meet 75%. So that's one threshold we want to cross. And then the next set of questions reflects how does the scenario as laid out help pursue the goals of Imagine Lexington or the current comprehensive plan as stated in that comprehensive plan. So starting with number one, and again, this is not new information. We've talked about this before, that at the top, what we found is that scenario one does not provide enough 75% of the total amount of housing unit demand for a 20-year period. The demand for a 20-year period is, for the high end, is 41,000 total household. So that would be equivalent to units. And scenario one only provides 27,600, I believe, is the total number. So that's less than, 30,000 would be 75%. It does not meet that. So it gets a 0 for that question. And then it also gets a 0 for, does it meet 75% of the high demand growth for industrial space? And we talked about that last week, that high demand line is pretty high given the amount of inventory that was added in Lexington in the first half, or the first 5 or 6, 8 years of our new millennium. And so based on that trend line, the 20-year trend line, which is like 5.6 million square feet, it does not match or meet that capacity even if we develop all of our available ED land and industrial land to full capacity. Similarly, scenario two, which doesn't really increase that industrial supply, does not meet that capacity either. So we would also not answer that question. The only scenario that does provide enough capacity for all, for both trend lines, including the 75% of high, is scenario three. And I will again remind everyone that the reason why scenario three can accommodate the high trend line is because it assumes a return to higher intensity of the building area on land ratio, similar to what was occurring on average for development before 2000. So industrial land in the most recent period, the last 10-year period, and then even in the last 20-year period, has been using more raw land per building footprint square footage than it had in the past. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. It could be, new site design guidelines that were for water retention, could be truck guidelines for truck parking or truck maneuverability. It could simply be the aesthetics of the site to attract tenants, setbacks to be better neighbors. All of these things could have been pushing in the direction of creating a less efficient use of the landscape. In scenario three, and again, some of those things may be harder to overcome than others, but it is certainly possible to suggest that we could be more efficient in the use of our industrial land on a per acre basis. That's what a scenario three would imply the city would encourage new development to try to do. And therefore, with that, it gets to, I think, 5.4 million square feet of industrial space available, almost meeting the 5.6 at the higher trend line. So right there is a good example of where this framework would set an opportunity for us to say, well, scenario two doesn't provide that capacity, but with an adjustment that we made for scenario three, it would provide that capacity. So the only way to provide that capacity would be to suggest that we have to make that adjustment. But as of now, the way we've laid it out, without that adjustment, it does not meet that criteria. So I'm going to stop right there and make sure that everybody follows my logic. Okay, I didn't hear anybody speak, so I'm going to keep going. And so basically, when we move down to the second level, you know, before we move to the second level, let's imagine a scenario like 10 years from now, where we now have 10 years of additional growth that we're trying to accommodate in our forecast of what's needed. And we recognize that despite our best efforts, or despite our efforts, maybe they weren't our best, but where we are today, it's just simply not possible to accommodate all the demand that we are now seeing, we're projecting for industrial space, for example. That would mean we would need to recognize that and say, there may be a need to expand based on that criteria. However, we would still want to score that scenario on the second phase, which is how well is it doing to pursue the goals of the comprehensive plan. So that while we may say this is a scenario that's reasonable, it still passes the goals of the comp plan in most respects, but in this one area, industrial land, it does not provide enough capacity. So our scenario would imply a need, even with its compliance with the comp plan, it would need some amount of land to accommodate that industrial supply. But what it wouldn't do is just say, well, we don't have enough land for industrial, so therefore we have to expand. The framework would still compel us to try to get a reasonable passing score on the second level before we came to that conclusion of expansion. So
okay, I'm sorry, may I jump
Sure.
in? This is an underlying question and a concern that I've raised before, but I feel like I needed to raise it again. What I'm least comfortable with is language that says, if it doesn't meet these thresholds, that means that we need to expand, as opposed to, if we see that it's not meeting thresholds, this is now a time when we need to consider whether to expand, and that the data is not the only information that we would use in answering that question. And so that language has been pervasive in the written materials and now in the spoken word. And I think that's, if everybody else is comfortable with that and they believe that the data alone is what determines whether we need to expand or not, the data about what's going on within the urban service boundary. If everybody else is comfortable with that, I'll let it go. But I'm not comfortable with that.
I'm not either, Steve.
My apologies. I should have reflected your previous comments. It would be the recommendation of the analyst to the Planning Commission is, according to our framework, using your language, consideration of expansion may be warranted. Among other, given this one element of the framework. But it wouldn't necessarily, I think so I apologize. That is definitely the language we discussed before, and I certainly have no problem with it. I didn't use it here, but it is definitely a point that it's not a trigger that is sacrosanct, that if it doesn't meet this data requirement, it requires expansion. It's just simply saying that not meeting that capacity requirement should not preclude having scenarios that still try to meet all other aspects of the comprehensive plan goals. That's where it's not just a flow chart that says, well, you failed, so exit the framework. And the goal is to try to continue in a situation where you go from not being able to accommodate to accommodate, and only when you feel like that's not a reasonable, that what you'd have to do is a reasonable expectation, you can still admit that, you can still concede that point, but you should still proceed through the rest of the evaluation and in your final, analysis recommendation, yeah, the language wouldn't be, we have to expand. It would simply be, perhaps expansion should be considered on that point.
Yeah,
But-
this is just providing the objective tool to make it clear that that discussion needs to happen, that it's an appropriate time for that discussion to move forward and be considered.
Excellent.
Okay.
Hey, guys, maybe I'm wrong on this, but I love to see things as simple and effective as possible. Would it not be easier if we all just agree on one scenario and not 3 scenarios, and just say this is a scenario of our plan for Lexington, the urban service boundary, whatever, and just agree on one instead of 3? Let me know your thoughts on that.
Well, I'll jump back in unless somebody else wants to, but I think there's again, this raises I think a policy question. This task force, as I understand it, is working on a process for evaluating whether and when or if an expansion is required, and where it might, and a process for determining outside the urban service boundary where land might be. If we're not setting a policy, we're not saying here's what the city needs to be doing in terms of anything within the urban service boundary, and choosing a scenario and saying this is what that we recommend the city commit to. I don't think it's within the responsibility of this task force. That's a broader policy question.
Okay.
Which has to be answered typically by the planning commission and then by the council. In my mind, the scenarios are informative, just
Okay.
like the data is informative. But I mean, as an example, relying on scenario 3, I have no objection to that, and simplifying in that manner if we think that scenarios 1 and 2 as proposed don't really provide much guidance or information to anybody. But just to be clear that we're not saying the city should be adopting scenario 3 as a policy goal.
Right.
Steve, can I follow up on that? Can you hear me?
Please, yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I concur with what Steve's saying, but I think from a practical standpoint, the use of land going forward that we can track are going to be just as useful, especially when it comes to industrial land, because I don't see us being that critical in industrial land, and we're spending an awful lot of time focusing on that. And somebody's got to show me where we have with the dairy farm and with the other 50 acres. I just can't see where this discussion on industrial land has driven this process.
I agree that we have probably spent an outsized amount of time talking about it simply because it is the one point where we have the framework is showing something that how would we use, again, back to the vice mayor's point, if these are demonstrative, if these scenarios are demonstrative of how the framework would work, this is where the industrial point is where we're demonstrating something unique, unlike retail or commercial. So that's the only reason. I also think that second point is that you're right. One of our recommendations about lessons learned from this project is that the development of the dairy farm, when it is available for lease and occupancy, how quickly it develops will be a much better indicator of how well, how much industrial demand truly is inside of the urban service boundary or Fayette County. And that will affect the trend line. We don't have a problem with the next 10 years as far as the availability of land. we have like an immediate issue waiting for the dairy farm to come online in some respects, but at the same time, there is still industrial land that's vacant or available for development. So in the medium term, we're not at a critical juncture, and I think one of our recommendations will simply be, whoever it is, the planning commission, the planning staff will have a much better ability to ascertain the true demand once the dairy farm is available. Right now, we simply don't have the type of land sites at a large spaces to really incur, the ability to expand like we did at the beginning of the millennia. So it's hard to really gauge whether the beginning of the millennia it would happen again or not. And once we have that land and we can see it's like that, like we can find out, we can test that theory, and it'll come relatively quickly. So I think our recommendation will simply be, this would be it would be good to pause and consider, waiting for that development to occur before we made any strong conclusions about the true demand of industrial.
Thank you, Mark.
I agree.
I would like to offer some thoughts. In the surrounding counties, the local governments own the industrial park, and they're selling land for $25,000 and $50,000 an acre. Free enterprise cannot bring that to the table. The local governments can do it because they get the payroll taxes. It's my belief that the local government should own some industrial land that would accommodate heavy industry and be able to sell it at these inexpensive prices to recruit these people to the community and grow the tax base.
Okay.
Thank you. And also I'd like to respond to Vice Mayor's point about these being in the co-chair's question about the scenarios. This is absolutely demonstrative in that these scenarios kind of line up, again, the spectrum of what could happen. And that's why we picked them. We didn't pick them all to be recommendations, certainly. We picked them more to be, what would it take to demonstrate the framework could analyze whether or not enough available land, or I should say, expansion should be something to be considered among other, as one element of that consideration. I think what we've seen here, and we'll get through the rest of this list in a second, but I think what we're seeing here is it illustrates it does demonstrate you have to do several things related to the pursuit of the comp plan for you to have enough capacity to comfortably meet what you're projecting in the future. And that is why the goals in the comp plan are there. It's kind of tying it back into a circle. You can do it if you follow these comp plan rules, because as we see, it's only in scenario 3 when we start to do some of put multiple things together from the comp plan that we actually can demonstrate, yes, we're comfortable with where we are as a scenario. So yeah, we could recommend a scenario 3 as saying, this is where we should try to focus our efforts, but that's redundant in the sense that that's what the comp plan is already basically saying.
Okay.
So we're showing scenarios 1, 2, and 3 again to demonstrate how it works in the future. That may not be, again, we've tried to lay this out as you probably do want to start out with the baseline scenarios, because whether you like it or not, that's what people can do. And that's what people will be like, working against, when they consider what development to pursue is the rules on the book. So unless you've, make some changes, scenario 1 is very, very possible. And therefore you'd really want to consider what it actually does. But in general, like you could immediately just say, we'll have scenario 1 baseline, and then the scenario 2, what we know works in the future, is a scenario 3. And that's what we would say was most likely would happen, is you would continue to work on your scenario 3 in this case as you move forward. So anyway, let's assume we've done the first part. We've done the raw calculations of square footage or acreage or units versus demand versus capacity. we'll move on to the second phase and we answer, oh shoot, I have to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see it now. And again, what I have done is create a summary of all three scenarios with the weighting as averaged for the responses we got back. And I'll read the questions because I know they can be hard to read on this screen, but you should have them in your packet, or at least the goals. And
I'm
so,
sorry, but we don't have that.
did
Don't
you?
have that data in our packet.
Well, you don't have this screen, but you have the questions.
Yeah, no, that's correct. You don't have the data in the packet. I just received the last, some of the input this morning. So it was updated right up to the last minute before the meeting. And I had provided it to Mark so he could place it on the screen. I could actually send it out right now while we're talking if it would be a benefit for everybody to receive that in the email inbox as well.
It would help me if I can put it on on my own larger screen. I really can't read those numbers. And I think this is going to be an important conversation.
Understood. I'm going to email that out to everybody. It'll be in your inbox in about a minute or so.
Hey, Mark,
Yes.
you might want to increase the font a little bit on the text, and does the scenario do something like that? I think that would be helpful. That's helpful. Thank you.
Let's see here.
Mark, while I'm doing this, I'm sure you can continue with just
Sure.
talking through these. It'll be out in just a moment here.
Sure. So again, in the second phase, we have 11 questions, or 11 basically questions related to the goals in the comp plan. And for each of those questions, we have a weight, and then we have a point scale from 0 to 4. 0 typically means it does not do anything, or it makes things worse. A 2 implies neutrality, that it's generally, or it's like neutral, or it does slightly better. And then 4 would say it definitely is positive, or does a significant job in going in that direction. If there is some question in the mind of the point score about whether it's one or another of the 3, that's where you would put a 1 or a 3 to illustrate that it's not absolutely not particularly clear. It's in the middle. So that's how we set up the points. So there's relatively simple enough to understand negative, positive, neutral, or somewhere in between of those markers. And so as we see in scenario, so we have scenarios. Let me see if I can get, there we go. Scenarios 1, 2, and 3, the points are in the center of the column, and I'll go through them quickly, I'll go through the different questions and kind of explain how the points change. So prioritize higher density development. The weight of the committee from a scale of 0 to 4, the average was 3.2 for the weight of this question. And the points were for scenario 1 was 0 because it doesn't really prioritize higher density development than what is already allowed today. The scenario 2 definitely does, where developable vacant land has current densities. We have raised them unless there was a development plan that was already in place to suggest that they're moving forward with an explicit plan, which we in that case we use that, but it definitely, from our scenario point perspective, prioritized higher density development. And in scenario 3, it prioritized much greater density, particularly in the R3 categories, but also so R3 is the planned residential category, where we went from what it is today, or allowable today, of 7.6 units per acre to up to 17 units per acre or more. in some cases. And so that's why it would get a 4. The next question is prioritize more diverse housing types. And in this case, the metric we would be using is how, again, is that density in R3, because really it's only in R3 where everything else, while we can have more units in R4 and R5, the apartment categories, the other residential categories are single family by lot. So they would be what they are. In R3, you could see depending on the density that you encourage to be developed in any R3 parcel, you could see a change from single family all the way up to apartments. So for scenario 1, where the density is relatively what we're seeing today of around 10 units per acre, we will give it 1 point because it is in fact probably a little bit more dense than what was typically occurring historically, but we're not actually encouraging anything beyond what people are doing now. In scenario 2, we are definitely going to have greater density like per acre, and therefore probably a stronger mix of single family attached or townhouses and even apartment buildings. And then by scenario 3, most of the R3 category and even the other category R4 and R5 will have more apartments. So we'll have in R3 you could still have a greater diversity of other types of units too. So we consider the use of our scenario of 3, especially when you consider it is also the only scenario that includes like an infill development component of assuming infill development along the catalyst sites that we've identified at some level at like 20 to 25% development goal. That would see the greatest prioritization of a more diverse housing style. So it gets the full credit for those points. Similarly, for question 11, prioritize mixed use development, scenario 1 doesn't prioritize it. It simply allows what, excuse me. It simply like allows what is there today, which does not really have much mixed use development potential in many of the vacant sites for sure. And so we say it doesn't prioritize, so it gets a 0. Scenario 2, because of the changes, the increased density in R3 category, it does in fact allow more mixed use or assume more mixed use to achieve that greater density. But it's not really a game changer. Really where the expectation of more mixed use development is likely to occur would be in the infill development that is generated as assumed in scenario 3. So that scenario 3, because it assumes an active encouragement of infill development, we can say it affirms and prioritizes mixed use development. Scenario of the next question, this had one of the highest weights, which is not surprising, 3.8 on average. To provide affordable, safe, affordable, accessible housing. Again, the metric here is how many total units can you provide, and what is the likelihood of those units being proportionally having higher number of multifamily units available, because multifamily implies an opportunity for more affordable units, and multifamily also implies ability for more diverse specialty types of units, including senior housing or even student housing. Like if you allow them to have that greater density to build that kind of development in the mixture of housing types to build that development, that should be the best opportunity from this perspective, a land use perspective, to getting those types of developments. So again, scenario 1, it's slightly more dense than what we're building today as of the zoning code is slightly more dense than previously historically has been the pattern in Lexington, but it doesn't really try to increase that amount in any specific way. Scenario 2 neutrally it does try to include it slightly by increasing greater density. So we would expect to see more multifamily and certainly more units. And then scenario 3 does it meets the actual total demand of new household units, so that's a plus. But there's still like obviously the potential for it to be better in terms of providing explicit types of housing, such as affordable housing and accessible housing for seniors. So we wouldn't say in our scenario that it's as good as it could possibly be. It's somewhere in the middle. So we said 3. Accommodate off-student housing. This was weighted relatively low. We looked at, so we created a 1.5 mile and a 1.5 mile buffer around University of Kentucky to suggest that like new units placed within proximity to the university would be the most direct way to measure whether you are providing more off-campus student housing. Because scenarios 1 and 2 generally only like deal with the development of vacant land, and while there are some single vacant plots within that 1 mile buffer, they are minimal by comparison for single family, for example. Generally, really, we're not seeing a change in the amount of new units explicitly, in scenarios 1 and 2. But in scenario 3, we do have, the opportunity for some infill development, including downtown, including, at the Red Mile location, including at off Nicholasville Road. It's all very much at the edges of that buffer. It's not a lot, but it's still, because it is trying to encourage infill development, we're going to say that it does something to try to accommodate off-student housing, but certainly not an explicit amount to warrant getting a higher score. Question 4, help Lexington identify and readily available publicly controlled economic development land to meet Fayette County's needs for jobs. Here, this is really, we gave it everything a 2 because this is really talking about the dairy farm. All scenarios look at the dairy farm, considers that to be reflective of that goal, but it's not necessarily going beyond what we were already doing. So we reflect that we're doing something that should help us achieve that goal, but it's not doing anything expressly or explicitly in addition to that. So we gave it 2. For help Lexington maximize development on vacant land within the urban service area and promote redevelopment of underutilized land. This again, so this got a 4. So everybody picked this as the highest weight, as to be expected. In this, our metric for this will be how efficiently, how densely do we develop vacant land, but also how do we develop excuse me, I think this score is wrong. This was supposed to be 2. How well do we develop underutilized land? So the scenario 1, again, we develop the vacant land at the same rate that we're doing currently, which if we did that would not be efficient enough to accommodate all our residential need. We don't focus at all on infill development. So it does somewhat try to it definitely is increasing the density over historical patterns, but not a lot. So we're going to give it a 1. For scenario 2, we are increasing the density on vacant land, but not really making any significant progress on redeveloping underutilized parcels for infill development. So it's basically a neutral. It meets that goal slightly. And then scenario 3, we are in fact creating this pretty efficient maximum efficiency on the remaining vacant residential land, and we are in fact encouraging infill development, but not at a significant level as to be like the absolute maximum development potential. In fact, we are saying we would expect under scenario 3 it would only be between 20 and 25% of that potential. So we're not going to give it a 4. We're going to say it's better than the neutral, but not as good as it could be, a 3. So again, on kind of following that, help Lexington emphasize redevelopment on underutilized corridors. Scenarios 1 and 2, we don't assume that occurs or is a priority. In scenario 3, we do at that level we previously talked about, so it gets a 3. And again, that scored, that was weighted a little bit higher at 3.2. For the help concentrate efforts to enhance mass transit. So the metric here would be how many residential units actually get developed within a quarter mile, a walking distance of a transit line. We don't, the new scenario 1 doesn't really make any effort to improve upon development along transit lines. We give that a 0. But scenario 2, we are assuming that the greater densities that could allow, could allow for those vacant lands that are within those buffers to have more households along transit than before. So we'll give that a 1, but it's not a great score. And then because of the explicit presumption of development along the corridors where transit is located in scenario 3, we would give that a 3. Again, it could be even better, but we're giving it a 3. And then for the prioritize multimodal options and de-emphasize single occupancy development, the metric again is how accessible it is to transit and how much mixed use development does it encourage, in infill development does it encourage. So it's a mixture of density and transit access. Really the only scenario that makes an explicit effort to do that is scenario 3. So it's the only one that gets points. And then the final question, does it have a positive impact on LFUCG finances? Here, we're going to say that since scenario 1 really only emphasizes single family, not single family, but the current standard of density for development, it's not going to get any points for creating a positive impact on LFUCG's finances, because really the only thing that can is greater densities and a greater mix of commercial and industrial development. So scenario 2 increases the densities and has, in some case, in that regard, has some opportunities for more mixed use development as part of R3 developments. It doesn't do a lot to change the dynamic. And then scenario 3, it actually does encourage the type of development that would probably return a positive impact on LFUCG finances. But obviously it could still do a lot more. And so that gets a 3. So that's how we scored them. Again, that's what our data is showing. We don't, is there a possibility that something could go from like a 0 to a 1 or a 1 to a 2? Yes, but we've gone over this several times enough to that feel pretty confident that this is how it would shake out according to our assumptions of what the scenarios are and what we put into the parcel database. And as you can see, ultimately, when we just sum up the scores, scenario 1 doesn't really get a lot of points because, again, it wasn't really trying to pursue the goals of the comp plan. Scenario 2 gets 16 out of the 44 available points, and scenario 3 gets 34 out of the available 44 points. And when we apply the weights, which is simply multiplying the weight to the points, we get these scores here, and that demonstrates that if we set our threshold at 60%, the only scenario that would gain enough points according to this weighting would be scenario 3. And in a nutshell, we can see that what has to happen in order to get a passing score is an increase in density and an emphasis on infill development. That those things, a lot of these questions all kind of blend together. They overlap, and we can definitely weight different attributes of what we're trying to accomplish differently. Like, for example, total density versus diversity of housing stock versus the ability to accommodate affordable housing units. We can weight those emphases differently, but ultimately we know that when we break them down in the scenarios that have the greater density and emphasize development where there's transit, development, like that's along the corridors that we want to see revitalized or redeveloped. Those are the two main elements that scenario 3 puts together and gets that higher score. So, and when I look at it, I see that scenario 2, we increased the density to try to accommodate all the demand we needed, but we really didn't change the fundamental development pattern to reflect infill development. And so it was only until we did that we see the score high enough to pass that threshold of meeting the goals of the comprehensive plan. So at this point, I'll stop and just discuss, ask if anybody has any questions or comments about the weighting or how the weighting affects the scores and how well you believe the framework itself, with our understanding of the distinctions between the scenarios, reflects what you would expect those final scores to be.
Mark, I think this is fabulous.
Well, thank
I
you.
really do. Does everybody feel comfortable with the weighting that we have in place?
I do.
Yeah, I do.
Well, I'm gonna have to weigh in with a somewhat different view. We had 6 responses out of how many task force members?
There's 13 task force members, sir.
Okay. So, and that's one issue, because this is, this is at the heart of at least the first step of the process. And so those weights are important. And of the 6, there's a fair amount of agreement on a few of them, and there's a pretty wide divergence on a number of them. And I had proposed the weighting exercise as a way to open up the discussion of how people viewed these criteria and coming, if possible, to a broader consensus about what the weights ought to be. So while taking the raw scores and getting an average of them tells us one thing, it does not really tell us how people are thinking about these. So if we have, I don't know, let me take an example. Number 14, we got a 2, a 1, a 3, a 4, a 3, a 1. Why do people see that differently? And how do we represent that to the community if we're asking them to accept this as an evaluation framework? And those are my concerns.
Well, one question I think we've asked is, when we provide weights, who does the weighting? I believe it's reasonable for us to recommend the weighting, but it also seems to me natural. What would come next would be that the Planning Commission would also want to weigh in on what the weighting should be. And so I'm not sure. Well, I think your point is well taken, that we should consider the diversity of opinion and what that means. I'm not sure exactly when the determination of the weights is set. And that's, I think, another thing that the task force I would probably provide some guidance on, how we want to move forward with the premise of how the weights are could be adjusted and who gets to adjust them, et cetera.
So from the staff side, I wanted to share the information that we had really as a starting point for the discussion today for the task force, with an eye toward the task force making a recommendation of what those weights should be to the Planning Commission. So that would be from the staff side, looking at schedule, there's a couple of goals that I'd like to see accomplished today. And the first would be coming to some sort of consensus, even in the form of a vote, a motion and a vote on those weights, if we can get there for each one of those questions. And also an additional discussion about we had assigned, I think, a 60% threshold for what was considered passing, in quotes, if you will, and I'd like to see some discussion on that. That would help from the staff side as well. I'm not sure if that helps guide any of the discussion, but I wanted to put that out there for your consideration.
Craig, if I can, I'm sorry to be talking so much, but if I can jump back in again, I think what Mark just said is for us most relevant. I think it's a way, the manner in which this is framed. If what we are sending forward basically says something a little more refined than this, but the task force did a very quick and dirty attempt to look at the weighting. And it's not meant to be representative of a policy recommendation, but the weighting and getting agreement about the weighting is going to be crucial to whether this is accepted broadly in the community. And so that needs a lot of work. But I don't think this task force needs to basically send a recommendation forward with our weights any more than it's just representative of a quick attempt.
I do feel like the planning commission, that this would fall under in their bailiwick. I think we can give them our guidance on it, but I think at the end of the day that they should do the weighting on these instead of our opinions. It's just my thought.
And as a current member of the planning commission, I will tell you that I think either way you go with this, the adoption of it is going to hinge upon if the planning commission can agree on the weighting. And you're going to ask the planning commission to adopt this. And so that's where the rubber is going to meet the road. As much as I don't look forward to doing this, I think it's going to be a necessary fact of life.
I agree, Frank.
It certainly is. I mean, it makes complete sense that like they are going to want to weigh in, no pun intended, on this. So it can't, obviously it won't be final until they agree on it. I do think that like, however quick and dirty this final weights are, I kind of backing up what Craig is trying to accomplish. If we had a certain level of demonstrable thought behind how, these are how we looked at it, and this is how we considered the questions and weighted them, that would help start the conversation with the planning commission. And I think we should probably work to try to get to that consensus if possible.
Councilperson Bledsoe, you had a comment or question?
Yes, thank you. I also turned in my responses, so I'm one of the 6. I thought I should just clarify that. And I thought, much like Vice Mayor did, that it showed very interestingly how we all view different things. Meaning you can see where there's quite a bit of consensus on a few of those things, and why there's other things that were that 1 to 4, which I think represents simply how different people think about those issues. And I think that's going to be emblematic probably at the planning commission level and at the council level if those were weights. And I think maybe, so here's the other thing about a check. And I had this thought, like if we're going to weigh those differently every year, you might weigh them differently based on needs or assessments that change. For instance, if all of a sudden we open up 500 acres of new economic development land because we have it, would that change the way you view that question? Probably. You may say we don't need to weigh it as high because that's a need we're not meeting. If that makes sense. That may change on a yearly basis, which might be something to a certain extent that the planning commission would need to vote on every year, or the council would need to vote on every year. And I'm only raising that as a consideration. I'm not making, I'm not pushing for that agenda. I'm just saying that your needs change based on the needs of the community. And I don't know how else to reflect that, but in the weights might be the easiest place to have that check. Just
Good point. Good point.
is there any conversation that we want to have about the diversity of opinion here? Or is it the focus that we know that it's up to the planning, it's ultimately a planning commission exercise as well? I tend to think that it would benefit us if we had any strong opinions about any particular weighting. Maybe since we only got 6 out of the 13, if we wanted to make an adjustment. However, if what I'm hearing is we don't necessarily want to make the adjustment, that's another way to go. But it seems like this is like an opportunity to at least give them a starting point.
My opinion is it would be worth us spending 5 minutes or so in reviewing, going back to that shared screen, taking each line item, finding the ones with the biggest variance and discussing those. I mean, obviously we can gloss over the ones that there's a consistency.
Sure, and I can try, let me expand this as much as I can.
So number,
Sorry.
Prioritize higher density development. To me, I can see why there's a great diversity with the members of this committee and of opinion, and I can see where 3 becomes a happy medium between the varying opinions of the members of this committee. But I think that's worthy of discussion. I would have a similar comment with line item 10, prioritize more diverse housing types. We're going to have varying opinions amongst the different professions and members here of this committee. 3 seems to be a happy medium.
I rank that actually the more diverse housing types very low, because actually what I think is that 9 and 10 may be overlapping.
Definitely.
And, that was it. I thought, well, high density development is going to be more diverse given our market and given what's been built. And so that's the only, so I'm an outlier on
Very
that.
logical though, what you said.
Yeah, but thank you.
Yeah.
But so just a comment. I mean, so sometimes a reason can, I don't know, it's not about the element itself, but the way it fits in the larger scheme. So that's all I want to say on that.
I think that's a good point that I probably should emphasize is, again, the overlap of some of these questions based on, what you can accomplish with just doing some of those things that are, are significant to do, increasing densities and encouraging development along corridors. It's the same thing. You're looking at the same thing in general, but it can affect these various questions in different perspectives or ways. And so I can also see why you would say, like, to me, the diversity of housing is the most important thing. And so, but the actual density is not, even though ultimately they're tied together.
Mm-hmm.
One thing that we've done in other assessments that kind of accomplish something similar is sometimes grouping items. And so an example here might be that at 9, 10, and 11 could each get, 1/3 of an overall score for that. So you could weight the combination of the 3 as a 4, and then they each bring up a 1/3 of that, or one of them's 50% and the other 2 are 25%. And so they combine together and work together in order to impact the overall evaluation, and that mitigates some of the overlapping of what they really accomplished. And we didn't go that route yet because it makes it further complicated and harder for people to understand on the surface. but it does accomplish mitigating some of what you were just discussing.
It's not actually even really doing anything differently. I think if we like what we in a way, we are emphasizing the relative proportionalness of each of these, of density versus corridor development, by having different weights for the questions that look at both. I think what we could do at the very least is kind of organizing them, and color coding them to suggest, hey, the most important factors here are density and mixed use house, like the types of development that come with that density, so that people understand, how they are related.
Mark,
I like that idea, Mark.
Mr. Robinson?
Mark,
I see Mr. Robinson's hand up, but he's muted.
Don, you're muted.
All right, can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
gotcha.
Okay, sorry. Again, my point has always been, I don't see how you can, I think I understand this process, but it strikes me that the priorities are really determined in land use process by the comp plan process. And I hate to keep coming back to that, but that's sort of the law. And so I get these scores, but to sort of Amanda's point, the goals and the weights change as the community moves along. So, and that's part of a comp plan process. It strikes me that is the weighting and the emphasis will change each comp plan to it or be tweaked. So this puzzles me. I see this as a framework, like Steve says, but it's very rough and dirty. I just think it's, I think we can't, put this in concrete. I don't feel comfortable doing it. I understand some of these, but I really don't think we can put a fix to it with a sort of consensus vote. Anyway, that's my feeling about it.
Don, I definitely agree that this needs to be a malleable process that the staff and planning commission can adjust over time. I mean, I also just as a comment would say that, if I had, to Councilperson Kay's point, I would give item number 12 a 10 if I could, as far as ability to provide safe and affordable housing. And his point about what questions are asked is very well taken.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay.
Don, as a sitting member of the Planning Commission, I'm going to have to talk about this. I don't want to speak for the rest of the members of the Planning Commission, so I'm trying to be careful. The goals and objectives are going to drive what the weight is on these items. And if the council feels like on their goals and objectives that we need to weight something heavier than before, then that certainly will be consideration to be done. So these are suggestions, these are guidelines, but the ultimate decisions are going to be made between the council and the planning commission in the comp plan process. And if we try to do it any other way, we got to change a whole lot of ordinances.
Yeah.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yay, finally. I'm a little disappointed that you guys didn't pick up on this pun. As Tom Petty sang, we all know the waiting is the hardest part. Okay?
Yeah.
So, yes, he was very insightful. I'm with respect to the waiting, I think that it is going to be a very dynamic process. It will change year by year. And, I'm coming back to the revenue stream, and I forget which question it is, which policy, 19 maybe, that talks about, fiscal resources for the city. And, if that is a high priority for the city because of budget constraints, then that question, that goal, I should say, should have a higher weight than other goals. So I don't think a uniform weighting system across all 10 or 11 questions can always work. I think that based on the context of how the county is developing, I think that these things will have to change, and I think we may have to pull individual goals away from others and assign higher weightings. Thank you all.
And I do think that is one of the ways that keeping this framework malleable, like this framework, it can be like we can. I mean, it's not obviously it's not. It's a pretty simple idea of you use data to establish points, a point scale, and then you use the policy presumptions to establish weights. And that is the reality. Is you could still in 5 years choose to like say, oh, we want a different weight scale. Like maybe we do want to like have, maybe we as a group, we want to say, to your point, that financial considerations should be double points. And it's, whether we say that's weight or, we change the weight scale to 8, why everything else gets to stay at 4, or, you just double the points or whatever. That's all possible, to make those kind of adjustments to the framework. So in that sense, it is flexible to do that. Again, it's not, if that was it doesn't sound like we want to be in the position to make those, distinctions between these questions. It doesn't sound like I'm getting that, that we know that this is going to be more likely to be at the planning commission level. So maybe the point is to say, is a 4-point scale on the weighting system enough? That like before we send it on further, we like give people a little bit more variability to what they could put on it. I mean, I tend to think that it is simply because people start to split hairs, and then if we're actually averaging things out, something that's 50% level, it's going to be a 50% level whether you make the scale 1 to 10 or 1 to 4. But it does certainly allow the opportunity to say some questions may be elevated. We believe some questions should be more of higher consideration. However, the reality is, everybody did. I guess the one way to look at that is if everybody gave 15 straight 4s across, would they have given it 5s if that was an option? And the same thing could maybe be applied to question 19 as well. And that's, it's maybe something to consider.
Hey, Mark, I just wanted to quickly echo, I think, what everybody's said so far about tying back to the comprehensive plan. And I think both from the point of just legally, but also I think, and this is maybe it's for Chris and Jim, but it seems to me setting these numbers is something that ought to be rooted in community, and community input and be representative of the people of the city. And the comprehensive plan process does a lot of that engagement already, and ought to be directly tied to how these priorities get set over time, and those things are going to change. So I think that's a really great way to sort of strengthen the results of this and where those numbers are coming from, and tie it back to a process that already exists. And maybe could be refined how you do that, but I think that's a really important piece that you all have been talking about.
Just so I'm clear, if I understand what you're saying, like the weights should reflect, if they're rooted in the community, are they reflected by the planning commission, or how would we assess weights from the comp plan or goals from the comp plan, and how they're variously weighted without an explicit weight from the comp plan?
Yeah, I think my point is the things that are in the comp plan, in theory, are based on community engagement that's been expressed in interests and vision and goals of the community. So I think that relationship is important, I think.
Right. And I think, thank you for that point. And I think reminds me of something I wanted to mention before is that, when we talk about how these weights could be changed year to year, when this analysis is done, or how often the weights are changed based on the current conditions and the current, issues that are driving the conversation. Kind of reminds me of what Jim Duncan mentioned, or emphasized, that this is supposed to be a way to like consider the question of expansion like uniquely outside of necessarily the entire comp plan process. And so these are all goals from the comp plan, and in any given period, what may be the more particular concern of the folks asking the question, whether it's the planning commission or the council or whatever reason we're going through this process, may say, like, this time around, we do think the emphasis, we would like to know what, like, if we emphasize this as more important, what would change? And so in that sense, it gives a little bit more of a independence to the analysis of this of the urban service boundary question, outside of, like, by emphasizing goals that are represented in the comp plan, but maybe saying we recognize we have an affordable housing issue. What if we weighted that as one of our highest priorities right now? What would this still be? How would that change the weighting? Or if, for example, we develop a new, once we develop the dairy farm, and that no longer is a priority for the community in theory, and so, like, we can de-emphasize that weighting. How does that change the weighting? And so it could give a little bit more flexibility to how the analysis is concluded over time, and given the explicit environment of the discussion. But I do appreciate, these questions are here because they're important, and it's really just about kind of like adding nuance to that.
I like the idea of going to a 10-point scale because it allows people to more boldly express their opinions.
And certainly we could do that if that's what. And I try to keep in mind who is ultimately going to be doing participating in that. If it's the planning commission or whoever, like that would just need to be, getting back to that consensus, as the vice mayor was kind of alluding to, would be relevant. That people could, it would still have to obviously be averaged at some point.
I've always seen this as something the staff would do because they're the professionals, and we're creating a tool for the staff to present to the planning commission and council.
I think you're right, Greg.
Just so I'm clear, Chair.
I agree with you there, Greg, very much.
Do you mean a 10-point scale for the score, not the weighting itself, correct?
Correct, for the score.
Understood. Thank you.
Oh, okay, I got you.
Because I may think something's a 7 instead of a 3.
Well, again, are you talking about the emphasis of the value of the question or the actual distinction of the scenario?
Instead of a 1 to 4 scale, it would be a 1 to 10 scale.
Not for these weightings, but for the
for my response, yes.
So, like, our points here would change from 0 to 4 to 0 to 10, or the weight would change from 0 to 10.
I think that the points would change. To me, that would allow someone to have a more drastic opinion. Is that reasonable?
The staff analyst.
Pardon me?
Like me, because if I'm doing the scoring, then okay.
Because I see this document as being, I see 8 staff people sitting around filling out a matrix and trying to come to some kind of a consensus. And if 6 of the staff people think it's an 8.
Well, the only pushback I would give on that is we were trying to keep these, well, we want to give it some scale as opposed to a binary choice. We were also trying to keep the ability to distinguish whether it meets the comp plan or it doesn't relatively straightforward, so that it's not necessarily, I mean, there shouldn't be like, among staff members looking at the data, a question about whether something is adding density because it's a math question, right? So like how the nuance would come in, is it prioritizing that density? And so in that sense, that's would be the distinction in the scale. And whether you go from 0 to 4 or 0 to 10, like, I think you have to set up that middle point that is still in the, like, the middle point is still going to be, it's relatively neutral, or it only is slightly doing what it should be doing. But while I understand why we would maybe want to have the opportunity for the difference of opinion among staff, ultimately, you know, they will be applied by these weights that would be distinctly determined by someone else. You know, and that would have as much of a ultimate effect as the scale of the points. Like, I guess where I'm going with this is we want to try to imply that the staff point, the points as applied by the staff, is more based on factual analysis and less on opinion.
Yes.
And the weight is based on the opinion of the priority.
I agree with you, Mark, on that totally.
I agree with you also, Mark. With that said, should the weight be a 1 to 10 scale? Thinking out loud. Again, I would give item number 12 a 10 weight. And that would be helpful in remedying the questions of 9, 10, and 11 being very similar.
That's true. I mean, we can, I'm curious what the rest of the task force thought about increasing the scale of the weight. I mean, if obviously I can go back and multiply everything by 2 and get to, or 2.5, and I can change this to a scale of 10 right now. But again, like, as for today, would the task force want another opportunity to rescore this with a 10 scale weight? Or is that just a recommendation going forward that ultimately the planning commission and the folks that will, or who are deciding what the weight should be, they use a 10-point scale instead of a 4-point scale?
Yeah, and there's multiple ways that we can arrive at that weighting. You know, we could have everybody just do what we did last time, redo it, and hopefully get more participation on a 1 to 10 scale. The other thing we could do is have you all rank them. And so, you know, of the ones that are there, everybody ranked them. What's the most important one? And then depending on how it's ranked, it would get that many points. And then we use that to calculate its relative weight to everything else. And so then the ones that aren't very important, that are consistently ranked low, their weight would end up being much less. And then the ones that are consistently ranked high would get more weight. And so you'd get a slightly different result than everybody just saying what they think it should be and averaging it versus ranking them in terms of which ones you think are more important than the others. So you'd have a 1 to 11. I mean, there's multiple ways to do it. We could do either one and see how it looks.
Dennis?
I have a comment and a question. Most of the polls
I've participated in have a 1 through 5. With the 1 through 10, I think what you may be doing is creating more outliers. I think Vice Mayor Kay has quite a bit of experience in this. I'd like to hear his opinions.
Thank you, Dennis. I'm going to mark this down as one of those days. I do have, actually, I'll identify it as a bias. With all respect, John, I don't like priority setting. I don't like rank ordering. I don't think that really gives you an indication of relative weights. I think you give them 10 points, but limit how many points they can put on any one item. And what you then get is a differentiation between the things that are really most important, and there may be only one of them. And then the next 2, 3, and how important they are relative. And then when you apply the scoring, you're getting a true reflection of how important that is at that particular moment. So
Yeah, so you like for example, everybody gets 50 points they can allocate across all of those items, and then you add it up that way.
It's more
That's a good
awkward.
one too.
It's more awkward with a group to manage that, but in fact, I think that gets you a truer reflection.
Because I could put all
really,
50 of my points on one and give everything else 0.
That's the downside. So you always have to look at the actual allocation of points. And if one item gets 50 and there's only one person who's on it, that's different from an item that gets 50 when there's 10 people and everybody gave it a 5. So the numbers themselves only tell you so much in the abstract. I think in order to get a true representation of what's really going on, that's why I'm kind of at a loss here. I didn't have the details of where who assigned which number, not who, but how many people gave it a 4 as opposed to a 1. So let me cut to the chase. I believe higher amount. I think the simplest thing, I would like to see it redone. Make it a 10-point scale. See if we can get more people involved, and you can put as many of, you can rank anything that you want from 1 to 10. And let's see if we don't then get some differentiation. We got some. There were a couple that were almost either all 4s or mostly 4s and 1 3. That's consensus. I would do it again and then see if we can have a conversation about what those numbers look like. And ideally get it out to us in advance so we can look at it.
I think that it needs to be weighted on the importance and the comprehensive plan. We've got to keep going back to that, not just our opinions, but how it is most seen in the comprehensive plan, each of these questions.
Well, I don't disagree. I believe that's the premise is these are all the relevant goals that could be applied to land use plan, the scenarios. And it would be like, I believe it's kind of that's where the particular perspectives could differ about what the comp plan is trying to accomplish and whatnot. And that's why we would want to get more people involved in how they're weighted. But they're all important. I mean, because when I hear your statement, it almost makes me feel like you want me to rank them, when in my opinion is no better than anyone's in that regard, because they're all they're all in the comp plan and they all should be emphasized in that regard.
I just thought
there are some people watching in the attendee list who practice planning and zoning laws, their professions. And I think that what they would tell you is that when you look at the comprehensive plan, all elements are equal. And they will, depending on who they're representing, they will emphasize the ones that they think are important and that help solidify their case. And they will downplay the other ones. This is an attempt to do something different. and to set some criteria in advance that generally we can get agreement about. There'll always be outliers. But I think what we're aiming for is to have a process that the broad range of people in the community, including the developers and all the people who work for them and the preservationists, and run down the list. They can look at it and they can say, this is a fair way to do the analysis. And that's what we don't have at the moment. And I think that's what we're trying to get. But setting criteria and weighting them, I think, is crucial.
Vice Mayor Kay, if we were to take another poll amongst the committee members and ask them to rank it on a 1 to 10, would it be for the weight or would it be for the points that we give them?
Good question.
Weight for each of the, what are we calling them?
Well,
Each of the elements that are now listed 9 through 19. Questions about the scenarios. Does that scenario prioritize Howard density development? Is that, how much weight do we give to that? And you know, where everybody has given something a 4, I presume what that means is that we believe that that deserves a you know, very serious consideration. If we have a 10-point scale, am I going to go all the way up to 10 on that? I don't know.
Can I ask just a different question maybe? And that is simply, so I feel comfortable giving these priorities because I'm weighing all those same things when I look at a project in front of me. Meaning I'm doing a very similar thing. Does it do these things? To what degree? And how strongly do I feel about that? And sometimes I make a decision based on that. If people didn't fill this out, is it because you're uncomfortable making those kinds of things because you don't have the right data or feel like you better have the best understanding to weigh them appropriately, or just this isn't helpful? And I only ask that because I think that might be helpful to know why we only got so many responses.
Amanda, I'll respond to that, Amanda, because I didn't send it in. And here's the reason why I didn't. I firmly believe in the comp plan process. And I firmly believe that goals and objectives are weighted, given their very right. And when you have 1,000 people come to over the course of a comp plan and do all these tables, and you speak to 1,000 people and they tell you what their goals and objectives are and what they'd like to see in our city, then I think that weighs it as much as what we can make it objective. And I just wasn't ready at this time. I don't know I'm ready right now to sit down and tell you what I think is the most important of those going forward, because we're still in a comp plan and I'm committed to developing this comp plan. And so I just have a hard time weighting these things right now because I don't know what it's going to look like even 3 years down the road.
I mean, that sounds to me as if the weighting should not be as critical as the scoring. Like the weighting between questions should be more neutral and it's the scoring itself that has more emphasis, because the questions that we're asking are all goals in the comp plan.
They are.
Right.
They definitely are. And I don't know right now how I would do it. And I don't know that I'm going to know a year from now until I see how the data is driven. To me, if you did this on a 5 or 10 year basis and you saw the trend lines and you saw the needs and you saw the disappearance of whatever land in whatever category, you can make an educated decision here. But now we're doing it with a hypothetical thing, and I'm not arguing with what Steve Kay said because he's certainly done a lot more of this than I have. But from a practical standpoint, I don't care how you do it. I think it's going to fall on the planning commission and the staff and the comp plan process to weight these if they have to be weighted.
And just purely again from the staff side, I was assuming that when we do bring this to the planning commission, that they would value the input from this task force. And that's the only extent to which I think this particular exercise is valuable. It provides them some input from this task force when they're making those decisions, which could help them through the process. So just wanted to put that out there as a consideration.
And Craig, I think you're exactly right. I just don't want to speak for what the rest of the planning commission will feel. And I know we're going to have the opportunity to do that. And so I'm just telling you from my perspective, going through 3 comp plans, unless we totally throw out the comp plan process, I think the weighted will happen regardless of what figures we put on.
I believe that we should still go through the exercise
I'm not saying we shouldn't.
of polling the committee members on a 1 to 10 scale on the weight. I think that we owe it to the process to come up with some kind of a resolution amongst this committee.
Okay. That's fine.
There were 2 other suggestions. There was ranking them, which Vice Mayor Kay did not support. And then there was assigning like a finite number of points. And so we could do a 10-point scale and an assignment of points, or do we just want to do the 10-point scale?
Good.
I'm going to defer to the vice mayor because I think he's got a lot of history with this.
I think what the vice mayor wants is all of us in a room with dots, and then we can appropriate.
Hey, Amanda, our pink slips.
That's what I was going to say. If we can't all get in a room and work on this, it's going to be extremely difficult. It's to do it the way that ideally I think it should be done. It's extremely difficult online, and so I'm kind of stuck. I think there may be a way to do it. I don't know. I keep having ideas and rejecting them. But I think the simplest thing to do at this point, given that this is just to be informative and guidance for the planning commission, is to go back and do it on a 1 to 10. Let people put as many, rank them however heavily they want for each one of these, and let's see what we get.
Okay.
Both in terms of the spread, because if there's an item that gets 5 1s and 5 10s, we want to know what's going on with that. What's the thinking? And that's the policy question.
Mark, can I make a suggestion?
Of course.
I was thinking because they've commented, the members of the committee have commented that some of the criteria are similar and or overlapping. Maybe one thing that we could do is combine as many of those as we can first, and then send them out for the weighting as Mr. K has suggested. I would say though that there was a discussion about combining 9, 10, and 11, and I think 9 and 10 are very similar and can be combined, but I think mixed use development is something that's very different than higher density. You can have higher density and not mixed use, and you can certainly have mixed use with higher density, but to combine all 3 of those, I think could be problematic from a planning staff perspective. So I think those 9 and 10 should be combined, and 11 should remain on its own. But I do think we can probably massage some of those other criteria and make fewer criteria for then the distribution of the weighting for purposes of the committee that I think would be helpful. And I do agree that maybe 1 through 10 will certainly identify the strength in some of those versus a 1 through 5.
I agree with Cynthia on the high density versus mixed use. Those are viewed very differently, I think, not just from staff, but certainly from people in the district or in my district. I think those are important to keep separate.
Thank you.
So
We send the goal out.
one
Yeah.
rule of thumb when working on these kinds of things is if there are suggestions for combinations, they're adopted only if there's no objection. So if anybody wants to keep them separate and thinks it's important to keep them separate, they ought to be kept separate. So, and I don't, at this point, I don't think there's much harm in leaving the list the way it is, and seeing what we get.
I think at the compromise could be we just thematically organize them so that people can kind of see like where the overlaps we feel are the strongest, so that you still weight them independently, but they like people, we can get people to think about them as they're actually being scored, like they're going to be scored on similar criteria.
It's a quick and dirty two-part categorizing that I would suggest, and that is some of those apply directly to density, however they're framed, and some of them are more policy related. So I don't know. I'm looking for
Certainly.
Yeah, but anyway, I think that's just one suggestion. But yeah, grouping them would help.
Okay.
Hey, Craig, is Lynn unmuted again? She's trying to speak.
She should be. I will check what's happening here.
Thank you.
I think she may have called back in with a phone number. I'm not certain that this is her phone number, but I'm going to bring the phone number in as a panelist and see what's happening here.
Let me see if she's on another line.
I am unmuted now. Thank you, Craig.
I wasn't sure that was your number. Sorry about that.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Yeah, the call dropped. Been crazy. So I agree with what the Vice Mayor is saying, that it's just as a matter of understanding the way this weighting works, is we would go through each of those goals, 9 through 19. Would we do scenario 1, scenario 2, scenario 3? So we would have 3 different sets of weighting. Or are we, can we get a little bit clearer perspective? I did not submit any weighting either because I was not clear on specifically what we were supposed to be weighting. Thank you.
So it's how much weight you would give to each of those items, no matter which scenario it's applied to. How important is that, period?
Okay, so can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so so if we had all of those 11 goals or elements, as you call them, Vice Mayor, then we are going to rank them all 1 through 10.
You're going to weight them all. So you give them some score, some weight between
Okay.
1 and 10. The
Got it.
heaviest,
Okay.
obviously 10 being heaviest.
Awesome, got it, thank you.
We talk about schedule related to this questionnaire that's going to go out, this request that's going to go out. How quickly can it go out? When do we expect responses back and so on?
I think we can get it out the door relatively quickly. The challenge will be the schedule moving forward with the task force's schedule, because it looks like we were originally scheduled to have a community meeting on the 12th of July at 6 p.m. And then the task force wasn't scheduled to meet again until the 21st of July. So clearly there needs to be a meeting before that point, because that meeting was tentatively set up to be the meeting where you would review kind of your final results and make a recommendation to the planning council, or planning commission rather.
I do think that meeting could take place after the 12th community meeting, though, don't you?
Sure. So I have 2 questions actually from the staff side, and the first would be about timeline for when you'd like to meet again. But the second would be whether that, how we handle that community meeting date, whether how fully cooked do we want this process to be before we speak to the community, if you will. So it'd be my preference that we have another discussion before that community meeting so that we have some of this process a little bit more solidified.
Yeah, I agree.
Answer questions better. So then the challenge becomes meeting between now and July 12th, understanding that many of you probably have some vacations coming up around the July 4th holiday. So I would leave it up to you, chairs, to lead that discussion if you'd like, regarding when you'd like to schedule your next meeting. And I'm glad to set that up and handle it from the staff side.
Craig, I'd like to see it sooner than later. Is there any possible way that we could do it before the 4th? Does that seem like an issue?
I think we could. Normally my first recommendation to you would be just to meet on a Wednesday at 1 o'clock again, except there's a public meeting next Wednesday at 1:30 that would conflict with this. So my recommendation, if it meets everybody's schedule, is that we would potentially meet next Wednesday, but in the morning rather than in the afternoon. And again, that's subject to discussion and agreement with everybody's schedule.
I will be flying. I will be in the air next Wednesday. What about Tuesday, the 29th?
Similarly, there's council meetings that afternoon starting at 1 o'clock, so it would have to be morning.
I'm booked up that whole day. It's a budget day, which is,
Okay.
I'm not, but I'm,
It doesn't work for me either. I've got a related council meeting in the morning.
Would we have a chance to get it done by the 28th and meet on the 28th? Or is that pushing it? That'd give us 2 days and the weekend.
From the staff side, we can make that work. It's just whatever the task force members are comfortable with. That gives you a pretty short turnaround to score that information, get it back to us, and allow us to provide that information to you prior to the meeting. So
That would work well for me.
I'm out, but I can submit my stuff on time and give my feedback via email if that's easier. My schedule's just really booked up until we go on break. So I'm happy to submit it via email to make sure you all meet.
Same with me. Same with me. And I wonder too, if we could talk about the goals of the community meeting. What exactly are we hoping to accomplish with that community meeting? Because we're going to be sharing the data, the existing conditions reports, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah, that was the thought on that, was that we would begin the meeting. Of course, we're just going to talk generally about the goals of this process, but we were going to share some of the information we have on the stakeholder meetings, the stakeholder interviews we had, discuss the existing conditions report. So we would want to briefly present some of the information that's contained in that report. We believe it would be of interest to the community. But then more importantly, get into the framework of this. And so that's why we want to make sure that we really have an opportunity to have a thorough discussion before this task force and have some agreement regarding that framework and what those scenarios look like and what that weighting may look like, understanding that all of this is just, it's being recommended to the Planning Commission, but we still want to receive that community input so that we can bring it back to you before there's a final recommendation coming out of this task force.
I don't think that we should have the meeting on next Monday, just because 2 of our very active committee members aren't able to attend. And
Okay.
I would propose, if it would work for everybody, that we push the community meeting from the 12th to the 19th and have July the 14th at 1 p.m. be our next committee meeting. And then we would have the July the 19th community meeting and then keep the July the 21st task force meeting. Would that work?
As long as it's still Zoom. For me, I'll be away.
That works for me. And I did have a question as we referenced the existing conditions report. Will there be a follow-up draft that incorporates some of the comments that have been made to it? And if so, if that's available, would you circulate it to the group?
Yes, absolutely. As soon as I've received comment. Is there anyone else still planning to submit any comments at this point?
I guess I'm personally not planning to submit any more other than what was discussed in our previous meetings. I just want to make sure. Okay, perfect.
So yes, I'll get that out to you, everybody, as soon as I've completed, which is just now that I know that I have everything. That should be easily early next week.
Great, just want to make sure. Thank you.
We'll also post that on the website once it's available, in addition to sending it out to the committee members here.
Can we count on that proposed revised schedule?
Can I read it back to make sure I have it correct?
Yes.
So we're looking at July the 14th, which I believe is a Wednesday, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
We would have a task force meeting at 1 p.m. and then the community meeting would be pushed to the 19th, which I believe is a Monday, keeping it at 6 p.m. And in the interim, we would send out the request and the related spreadsheet to the task force members, asking them to rank, again, the weighting for each one of those items on a 10-point scale. How long would you like to respond to those? We have much more discretion if we go with this schedule. We have plenty of time to tabulate results and so on. 5 days or something like that.
I would ask for at least a week.
Okay.
We can get that out tonight, this evening, and so that we could get that back like next Wednesday.
Yeah, I was just going to say on the, if we're meeting as a committee on the 14th, I want to make sure that the data are as robust as possible, because that information can be weaponized. That information will be out for public scrutiny, and I want to ensure that we all find it defensible and legitimate. And we've gone through it, but we haven't really rolled up our sleeves and talked about it. So that a little bit concerns me.
Shall we move on to, if there's no other comments, shall we move on to public comment?
Sure.
Yeah.
Craig, do you see anybody out there with their?
If there's anybody in the attendees room that would like to speak to the task force and make comment, please raise your blue hand at this time. We'll bring you into the meeting. Here's, I'm not seeing any.
With that said, I hope everybody has a wonderful 4th of July. Thank you all for your time. And we look forward to seeing you back on the 14th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody.